Being the first president of the United States, George Washington has many distinctions. Notably, he was the first and one of only two presidents to go uncontested in a presidential election. Washington was elected president twice, and both times went uncontested. John Adams was the first president not to be a slave owner. His son, John Quincy Adams, also never owned slaves. They are the only two presidents of the first 12 with this distinction. Thomas Jefferson was the first of 20 presidents to also serve as governor. Jefferson served as the second governor of Virginia for 2 years, starting when he was 36. James Madison's mother was still alive by the end of his 8-year presidency, making him the first president with a parent still alive upon leaving office. Eleanor Rose Conway Madison was 20 when the future president was born. She died in 1829 at age 98. James Monroe was the first of 17 presidents to have previously served as senator. John Quincy Adams was the first president to be photographed. However, he wasn't the first president to be photographed while serving as president. Adams served from 1825 to 1829. The popular photograph of Adams was taken in 1843, leaving many today to think Adams looked much older while he was serving as president than he actually did. With a history marred by violence, duels, and war, it might come as no surprise that Andrew Jackson was the first president to survive an assassination attempt while in office. An unemployed painter tried to shoot Jackson, but his pistol misfired. The 66-year-old president attacked his would-be assassin with his cane. He only stopped when others intervened. Martin Van Buren is the first and only president to have learned English as a second language. As his father was descended from the Netherlands, Van Buren grew up speaking Dutch and only learned English once he was in school. There was a photo taken of William Henry Harrison after his inaugural address in 1841. Making him the first president to have his photograph taken while in office. However, the photo has since been lost. Thus, the earliest existing photograph of a president in office is of 11th President James K. Polk. John Tyler was the first president to be widowed while in the White House and the first to remarry while in the White House. Letitia Christian Tyler died during Tyler's second year in office. Later that year, he took interest in 22-year-old Julia Gardner, being 30 years her senior. The couple wed 2 years later, during the final months of Tyler's presidency. James K. Polk was the first president to be outlived by a parent, his mother. This would be the case for many later presidents who died in office, but Polk actually lived out his term. He died 2 months after the end of his presidency, at age 53. It was likely cholera that killed him. He was also the first president to die before turning 60. Polk came into the White House with gusto and vigor, like his predecessor and mentor Andrew Jackson, but 4 years in the office took a heavy toll. In 1848, Zachary Taylor became the first of 5 presidents to assume office without having been elected to a public office prior. Even George Washington, who is primarily known for his role in the War for Independence, had prior experience in Virginia politics. Taylor won the election mainly due to his fame as a national hero during the Mexican-American War. Millard Fillmore was the first president to leave office with his father still alive. Furthermore, his father, Nathaniel Fillmore, was vibrant and healthy, even as he approached 80 years. When he visited the White House, other guests were astonished by how he looked so close in age to the president. Nathaniel eventually died at 91, 10 years after his son left office. Franklin Pierce delivered his inaugural address from memory, being the first president to do so rather than reading it. This alone was impressive, but perhaps even more so as Pierce was still devastated by the death of his son only months earlier. Though often considered one of the worst and sometimes the single worst president, Pierce's ability as a charismatic statesman is unquestioned. James Buchanan was the first president to be born in Pennsylvania. For over a century and a half, he was the only president from the state until 46th President Joe Biden assumed the office in 2020. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to have a full beard while in office. Following his vice president, Andrew Johnson, his next three Republican successors, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, and James A. Garfield, would also have full beards. While James Monroe was the first president to serve in the Senate prior to becoming president, Andrew Johnson was the first to serve after being president. Thus far, no other president has done so. Ulysses S. Grant was the first president to allow for the creation of a national park by the Act of Dedication, thus creating Yellowstone National Park. Grant had a love of nature since his youth, being an avid outdoorsman and horse rider. During Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency, the White House had its first telephone installed. Hayes is often quoted as saying of the telephone, quote, "It's a great invention, but who would ever want to use one?" Even 44th President Barack Obama quoted Hayes as saying this during a speech. According to historians, however, Hayes never made this statement. He was actually very enthusiastic about new technologies. He even had Thomas Edison visit the White House during his presidency and show off one of his new inventions. James A. Garfield was ambidextrous and the first left-handed president, or at least the first known left-handed president. In contrast with the previous century, the 20th century saw many left-handed presidents, such as Harry S. Truman, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton. Chester A. Arthur was the first president to have an elevator installed in the White House. While he wasn't the first president to be married while serving as president, Grover Cleveland was the first to get married in the White House. Going into his presidency, Cleveland was a bachelor. He was also the first president to have a child born in the White House. Benjamin Harrison was the first president to have a lighted Christmas tree in the White House. Harrison notoriously hated the presidency, often quitting work days at noon. Upon the end of his term, he said he felt as though he were being freed from prison. He much preferred spending time with his children, who lived at the White House along with their children. During Christmas, he would dress up as Santa Claus and spoil his grandchildren with gifts. William McKinley was the first president to ride in an automobile. It was a steam-powered automobile invented by O.F. Stanley, and very different from the cars of today. McKinley's ride wasn't an enjoyable one. He felt as though, at best, the driver would lose control, or at worst, the vehicle would explode on its bumpy ride. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to be wounded by an assassin after serving as president. In October 1912, Roosevelt was campaigning for an unprecedented third term when he was struck by a single bullet fired by a mentally ill man. The bullet lodged in Roosevelt's chest muscles. It was slowed down after passing through a steel eyeglasses case and a copy of a speech. As he wasn't coughing blood, Roosevelt correctly concluded that the bullet hadn't reached his lung. Therefore, he asked the police to take away the would-be assassin, but not to do him any harm. Then, he began and finished an entire speech before receiving medical attention. William Howard Taft was the first president to have also served on the Supreme Court. In 1921, 8 years after leaving office, Taft became the court's Chief Justice. Despite the presidency being the more highly acclaimed office, serving on the Supreme Court was actually Taft's lifelong dream. Woodrow Wilson is actually the first president to be buried in Washington, D.C. He remains the only president buried in the district. In 1923, Warren G. Harding became the first president to die before his father. He passed unexpectedly during the third year of his term due to a heart attack. The first radio broadcast from the White House was given by Calvin Coolidge in 1924. It was a tribute to his predecessor, Warren G. Harding. Harding was actually the first to have his voice broadcast on the radio, but Coolidge would make excessive use of the technology during his 6 years. The iconic image of the phone at the president's desk began with Herbert Hoover. While President Hayes was the first to have a telephone installed in the White House, Hoover was the first to have a phone on the president's desk. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first president who traveled via airplane while serving as president. Prior to this, it was actually considered unsafe for a president to fly on an airplane, though Roosevelt would make extensive use of flight during his 12-year presidency, allowing him to visit Haiti, Iran, and the Soviet Union. He was also the first president to visit each of these nations. Ironically, Roosevelt's fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, had been the first president to fly via any aircraft, though this was after his presidency. Harry S. Truman was the first president to visit Germany. After the surrender of the Nazis, Truman met with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill in Ally-occupied territory. Hawaii and Alaska were only admitted into the Union in 1959. Thus, Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president to govern all 50 states. Along with Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy was the first president to compete in a live televised presidential debate. In prior elections, presidential debates weren't standard practice. In the 1940 election, Franklin Roosevelt's Republican rival, Wendell Willkie, proposed the idea of a radio broadcasted debate, but Roosevelt declined. Lyndon B. Johnson was the first president to appoint an African American to the Supreme Court. With the appointment of Thurgood Marshall, Johnson remarked that he, quote, deserves the appointment. I believe it is the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place. Two other African American judges have since served on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Richard Nixon was the first vice president to be elected to the office of president without being the incumbent vice president. When John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Martin Van Buren were elected president, they were serving as vice president for the current administration. Nixon served as vice president for Dwight Eisenhower from 1953 to 1961. He did run in the election of 1960 but lost to Kennedy. He would finally win the presidency for himself in 1968. Gerald Ford was the first and only president to never be elected to the office. Some presidents, such as John Tyler and Andrew Johnson, only assumed the office after the death of their predecessor and would never win an election of their own. However, they were on the presidential ticket as vice president. When Nixon was running for re-election in 1972, his running mate was Spiro Agnew. Agnew resigned early in Nixon's second term, and it was only then that Nixon made Ford his new vice president. Prior to this position, Ford was serving as House Minority Leader. Jimmy Carter was the first president to use his nickname rather than his real name, James Earl Carter Jr., in an official capacity. Carter signed documents using his nickname and even used it while taking the oath of office. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became the first president to survive an assassination attempt in office despite being wounded. A bullet which hit Reagan in his underarm broke his rib and punctured his lung, causing internal bleeding. It's believed that it was only for the quick thinking of a Secret Service agent, Jerry Parr, that Ronald Reagan survived. George H.W. Bush was the first president to have previously served as acting president. In this role, the president passes presidential power to the vice president for a limited period of time. Bush served as acting president for 8 hours while Ronald Reagan underwent colon cancer surgery. Bill Clinton was the first president to send an email. He didn't use digital communication often, however, preferring face-to-face interactions. George W. Bush was the first president to leave office with both his parents alive. George Bush Sr. and Barbara Bush lived through their son's 8 years, Barack Obama's 2 terms, and died during Donald Trump's term in 2018. Both were in their 90s. The official presidential portrait of Barack Obama, taken in 2009, was taken with a digital camera, making him the first president with this distinction. Donald Trump is the first president to have assumed office without having ever been elected to a political office, held a public office, or have military experience. Other presidents, such as Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, had never previously been elected, but were military generals. Herbert Hoover hadn't previously been elected, but served in the administrations of Woodrow Wilson and Calvin Coolidge. Joe Biden is the first president to have served as a senator for over 35 years. The president with the second most years in the Senate, Lyndon B. Johnson, served 12. To support regular uploads from this channel, consider subscribing and donating to Resyndicated it on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads. Patreon link in the description below.